This is a story about medicine, art supplies, and dinner parties. It is also a story about eating dead people. These are the same story. In the 12th century, European merchants arrived in Egypt and noticed something interesting about the mummies. Not the history, not the culture, not the 4,000-year-old civilization that had produced them. No, they noticed that the black resin coating the wrappings looked a lot like bitumen, a substance that was already being used in European medicine as a cure for, essentially, everything. So they did what Europeans historically do when they find something valuable in someone else's country. They took it. At first, they scraped the resin off the wrappings. Then they ground up the wrappings themselves. Then, and this is the part where you will want to sit down, they ground up the mummies, the entire mummy. Bones, flesh, linen, resin, and whatever was left of a person who had been carefully preserved by a civilization that believed the body needed to remain intact for the afterlife. They put it in jars. They sold it at pharmacies. They called it mumia, and for the next 500 years, Europeans consumed dead Egyptians as medicine. This is not a metaphor. This is a pharmacy receipt. The list of ailments that mummy powder supposedly cured is, by modern standards, ambitious. Headaches, nausea, epilepsy, bruising, internal bleeding, coughs, vertigo, paralysis, poisoning. It was rubbed on skin, mixed into tinctures, dissolved in wine, and, in particularly committed cases, eaten straight. King Francis I of France carried a small pouch of mummy powder and rhubarb mixed together. He kept it on his person at all times in case of emergencies. This was the 16th century equivalent of keeping Advil in your bag, except the Advil was a person. The demand was enormous. At its peak, mummy powder was one of the most traded medical commodities in Europe. Apothecaries stocked it the way a modern pharmacy stocks paracetamol. It was prescribed by real doctors, endorsed by real medical texts, and consumed by real patients who presumably did not spend too long thinking about where it came from. Some of them did think about it. The French surgeon Ambroise Paré refused to prescribe it, not because it was a person, but because he said it did not work. He noted that patients who took mummy powder did not improve and frequently vomited, which, and this is worth saying out loud, is a reasonable response to eating a mummy. He was ignored. The mummy trade continued. Here is where it gets worse. Demand outstripped supply. There are only so many ancient Egyptian mummies. They are, by definition, a non-renewable resource. So suppliers began making their own. They took the recently dead, executed criminals, unclaimed bodies, people who had died of plague and were not being closely watched. And they mummified them. Quickly. Badly. They stuffed the bodies with bitumen, dried them in the sun, and shipped them to Europe labeled as ancient Egyptian artifacts. The European patient is now eating a person who died last month and was dressed up as a pharaoh. This is the supply chain. A traveler in Egypt in the 1560s described watching a merchant prepare fresh mummies for export. The bodies were filled with resin, wrapped in linen, and left in the sand. The entire process took about 2 weeks. The merchant was producing roughly 40 mummies per year. He did not appear to find this unusual. Nobody checked. Nobody held the jar up to the light and said, "Excuse me, is this a 4,000-year-old priest? Or is this a man named Ahmed who died of dysentery on Tuesday?" The answer would not have changed the price. But the mummies were not only eaten. They were also painted with. In the 16th century, European artists discovered that ground-up mummy, specifically the resin-soaked flesh, produced a rich, warm, semi-transparent brown pigment. They called it mummy brown. It was used for shadows, skin tones, and glazing. It was beautiful. It was also a person. The pre-Raphaelites used it. It appeared in paintings that now hang in major galleries. You have almost certainly looked at a painting made of someone's uncle. You did not know. The wall label does not mention it. The painter Edward Burne-Jones reportedly owned a tube of mummy brown for years before discovering what it was made of. When he found out, he gave it a full burial in his garden. which is either the most respectful thing in this story or the strangest, depending on how you feel about burying paint. The pigment was commercially available until 1964. 1964. The Beatles were recording A Hard Day's Night, and you could still walk into an art supply shop and buy a tube of ground-up human being. The manufacturer discontinued it, not for moral reasons, but because, and this is a direct quote, they ran out of mummies. There is one more part, and it is the part that stays. In the 19th century, Victorians held events called mummy unwrapping parties. A host would acquire an Egyptian mummy, purchased from a dealer, shipped across the Mediterranean, delivered to a townhouse in London, and invite guests to watch it be unwrapped in the drawing room, over drinks. They peeled back layers of linen that had been placed by someone whose specific job was to prepare a person for eternity. They examined the face. Sometimes they took souvenirs, a finger bone, a piece of wrapping, an amulet that had been placed over the heart to guide the dead through the underworld. The person inside the wrapping was someone. They had a name, probably something like Ankesinamun or Jedtahufunk, something the partygoers could not pronounce and the owner spent a lifetime answering to. They had a family who prepared their body with care, who placed each amulet with specific intent, who whispered prayers that took 4,000 years to stop being heard. The linen was not packaging. It was a promise. You will be whole when you reach the other side. 4,000 years of kept promise, undone in a drawing room, over drinks. Nobody in the room considered this disrespectful. Not because they were monsters, but because the distance between their world and the person in the wrapping was so vast, temporally, culturally, linguistically, that the mummy had stopped being a person and had become a thing, a curiosity, a spectacle, a product. You are probably thinking, we would not do that now. And you are right. We would not unwrap a mummy at a party. We would not eat one. We would not paint with one. But we do have Egyptian artifacts in museums that were taken without permission. We do have human remains on display behind glass. We do have a long and continuing history of treating other cultures' dead as our educational materials and their sacred objects as our souvenirs. We just stopped grinding them into powder, mostly.